It was a hot and humid morning on July 12, 1997, the kind of day where the heat clung to the pavement and the sky seemed to sag under its own weight. At exactly 6 a.m., 33-year-old Marlene Whitaker arrived at the Indianapolis Central Post Office to begin her shift. Clad in her crisp USPS uniform and a baseball cap shielding her eyes from the rising sun, she gave her usual wave to the security guard and began loading up her delivery truck. Marlene was known for her punctuality and diligence, 10 years on the job, never a complaint, never a day late. Her coworkers often joked that the Postal Service ran on Marlene's schedule, not the other way around. That morning she was assigned Route 17, a long stretch that wound through quiet suburban streets, an old industrial park, and eventually skirted alongside a section of the city's historic canal. Marlene wasn't particularly fond of that route. It passed through some overgrown lots and abandoned buildings, but she never complained. With her earbuds in and her thermos of coffee at her side, she set out just after 6:45 a.m., her mail truck rattling out into the heat haze. By mid-morning, Marlene was seen on multiple doorbell cameras and by a few friendly residents. She greeted kids playing on front lawns and handed mail directly to the elderly who waited at their porches. Everything about her route seemed normal, until it wasn't. Around 2:15 p.m., a resident on the far end of the route noticed that their mail hadn't arrived. They thought little of it, maybe Marlene was running late. But by 4 p.m., concerned calls started coming in. Another resident spotted her truck parked strangely near the bend in the canal, with the driver's door wide open and no one inside. Her mailbag lay on the ground, letters scattered like leaves across the sidewalk. It was as if she had simply vanished mid-step, into thin air, without a sound, without a trace. The moment police arrived at the scene, the atmosphere felt off, like something important had slipped just out of reach. Marlene's white USPS truck was idling quietly near a dense patch of overgrown weeds by the canal's curve. The driver's door hung wide open, her seatbelt dangling outside and flapping slightly in the breeze. A half-finished bottle of water rested in the cup holder, and her handheld scanner was still logged into her route. Most haunting of all, her mailbag was lying on the concrete beside the canal, its contents partially spilled out, some letters floating near the water's edge, others clinging damply to the grass. Detectives secured the area quickly. They checked the truck thoroughly, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no blood. Her wallet and cell phone were still on the seat, untouched. It was as if she had paused mid-task and simply vanished into the surrounding silence. Several officers canvassed the area, speaking to residents and workers in nearby buildings. A few remembered seeing her truck earlier in the day, but no one had seen her leave it. The canal, dark and murky, was partially obscured by reeds and brush. A dive team was brought in that evening, scouring the section of water near where the truck was found. Despite hours of searching, nothing turned up. No body, no clothing, no sign of a fall. It was as if the canal had swallowed her whole, leaving only mystery behind. One strange lead came from a homeless man who sometimes slept under the nearby footbridge. He told police he'd heard a sharp, startled scream around 2:30 p.m., followed by the sound of something heavy hitting water. When they questioned him further, he grew nervous and couldn't give a clear account. His story changed slightly each time, and without physical evidence, authorities couldn't rely on it. In the following days, flyers went up across the city. Search parties fanned out across trails, warehouses, and empty lots. Helicopters scanned the canal's full length. But nothing, no clothing, no footprints, not a single clue that told them where Marlene had gone. The only thing left was the eerie emptiness of the route, the still running truck, and a silence that seemed too loud. Weeks turned into months, and the case of Marlene Whitaker's disappearance began to fade from the headlines, slowly slipping into the shadows of unsolved mysteries. Despite the urgency in those first few days, helicopters circling, dogs sniffing through industrial yards, divers combing the canal, the trail had gone cold. There were no eyewitnesses beyond the unreliable account of the homeless man, no video surveillance that captured anything after 2:30 p.m., and no physical evidence suggesting foul play. The investigators, once confident they'd find answers quickly, were now left chasing theories that led nowhere. Marlene's family, especially her husband Steve, refused to let her name disappear. He launched his own small campaign, handing out flyers every weekend, appearing on local radio stations, pleading for information. "She didn't just walk away," he said in one interview, voice trembling. "Something happened to her. Someone knows something." The most painful part was the absence of closure. Her two children, aged 9 and 12 at the time, would ask questions no one could answer. Did Mom get lost? Is she hiding? Is she coming back? The family kept her room untouched, her mailbag hanging on the hook by the front door. Every birthday and holiday passed like a quiet wound. No new photos, no phone calls, just memories and what-ifs. Over time, people in the neighborhood moved on. New residents didn't even know the story. The stretch of Route 17 that passed by the canal was reassigned to another driver, though few stayed on it long. One carrier reportedly requested a route change after claiming they felt watched near the bend. Locals started calling it Ghost Curve. With no new evidence and no suspects, the Indianapolis Police Department quietly shifted resources away from the case. It remained open, but in reality, it sat on a dusty shelf like dozens of other cold files. Occasionally, a new detective would review it, hoping for a missed detail, but none ever emerged. Meanwhile, the canal continued to flow, murky and undisturbed, keeping its secrets buried deep in the silt. And Marlene Whitaker's name remained etched into a growing wall of unsolved disappearances, one more person who simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary day. 7 long years passed, and Marlene Whitaker's disappearance became a footnote in the city's history, an unsolved mystery that locals spoke of in hushed tones or had forgotten altogether. Her case remained dormant, collecting dust in a cold case file cabinet. The Whitaker family, though forever scarred, had been forced to continue with life, clinging to the smallest thread of hope while facing the overwhelming weight of reality. Then, in the spring of 2004, an unexpected city infrastructure project stirred up something long buried, something no one could have imagined. Indianapolis had been working on a major revitalization plan aimed at modernizing parts of the city's aging canal system. Decades of buildup had slowed water flow and led to dangerous levels of algae and pollutants. One of the project's most crucial steps involved draining a large, neglected stretch of the canal that ran behind abandoned warehouses, not far from where Marlene's truck had been found all those years ago. No one expected anything more than trash, tires, and maybe a rusted shopping cart or two. In mid-April, city workers began lowering the water levels. As the murky water receded, thick layers of black silt were exposed, along with piles of junk accumulated over the years: bicycles, broken signs, barrels. A cleanup team in protective gear waded in with shovels and large hooks, dragging debris to shore. It was routine work until one worker, tugging at what looked like a twisted metal signpost, uncovered something chilling: a corroded keyring with a faded USPS tag. The find stopped the entire operation. Just feet away, partially submerged in thick mud and trapped beneath a broken drainage grate, were the skeletal remains of a human body. Nearby was a scrap of blue-gray fabric, distinctive in its stripes and color. It matched the USPS uniform still listed on Marlene's missing person report. Word spread quickly, and soon police had cordoned off the entire area. Forensic experts arrived to carefully excavate the site. The body was largely intact, albeit worn by time and decay. Bones bore signs of damage, particularly a deep fracture on the skull. A wedding ring, still looped around a brittle finger, matched the description of the custom ring Steve Whitaker had given Marlene on their 10th anniversary. That was the moment authorities knew the canal had finally given up its secret. The discovery made headlines across the state. Reporters returned to the neighborhood that had once rallied around the missing mail carrier, and Marlene's family, after 7 agonizing years, received confirmation of what they had feared. The grief was raw all over again, but this time it was accompanied by purpose. Her death had been ruled a homicide. The canal, quiet and sluggish for years, had spoken. And with that, the investigation was reborn. The identification process was swift but devastating. Dental records confirmed what the wedding band and the remnants of a USPS uniform had already strongly suggested: the skeletal remains found in the canal belonged to Marlene Whitaker. Forensic teams conducted a thorough autopsy, though the years underwater had eroded much of the soft tissue. Still, the evidence they did find painted a disturbing picture. A deep fracture along the left side of the skull pointed to a powerful, deliberate blow, strong enough to kill instantly or render someone unconscious. Additionally, damage to the wrist bones hinted at possible restraint, perhaps bound before or after death. The coroner's report made one thing chillingly clear: this was no accident. Marlene hadn't fallen. She had been murdered and then discarded like trash in the canal, her body hidden beneath layers of muck and metal to keep it from ever being found. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase her existence, and for 7 years, it had worked. The announcement of her identification sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets reignited their interest, and former co-workers, neighbors, and local officials gave interviews remembering Marlene as cheerful, dedicated, and deeply loved by her community. Her photo, once faded and curling on missing posters, returned to screens and bulletin boards everywhere, but this time, under the bold, heartbreaking caption, "Remains confirmed." For her family, the confirmation brought a strange mix of relief and devastation. Steve Whitaker had long suspected that his wife hadn't simply vanished or run away, despite whispers from those who couldn't understand how someone could disappear so completely. But knowing the truth, knowing she had been murdered and left in the shadows of the city, was almost more painful than not knowing at all. Their children, now teenagers, were old enough to fully grasp what had happened. They mourned her not just as a lost parent, but now as a victim of violence, stolen from them without explanation. Detectives, armed with new evidence and renewed public pressure, reopened the case with fresh urgency. They began retracing every step of the original investigation, this time with a clear focus: someone had killed Marlene Whitaker. This was no longer just a missing person case, it was a homicide, and the killer had been walking free for 7 years. One pressing question loomed large over the investigation: why? What motive could someone have to murder a mail carrier on her route, in broad daylight? Investigators revisited old reports, interviewed past co-workers, residents on Route 17, and combed through any previous complaints or suspicious activity logged during her time as a USPS driver. Somewhere in the past, buried like her body had been, was a clue. And now that the truth had begun to surface, detectives were determined not to let it sink again. As the news of Marlene Whitaker's recovered remains echoed through Indianapolis, a ripple of renewed interest spread among both the public and law enforcement. Detectives reopened every box, revisited every transcript, and analyzed every photo and statement with sharpened eyes. With the case now officially reclassified as a homicide, the Cold Case Division poured their efforts into what had once seemed like a dead end. But it wasn't just the forensic evidence or physical clues that breathed life into the investigation. It was a piece of forgotten technology and a quiet voice from the past. A few weeks after the discovery, an anonymous tip landed in the inbox of the lead detective. The message was short: "You need to check the garage across from the Canal warehouse." The old man had a camera back then, he used to record everything. That tip led investigators to a long-shuttered auto garage, owned in the 90s by a reclusive mechanic named Earl Madison. Earl had passed away in 2001, but his son, now living out of state, agreed to let detectives examine the building before it was demolished. Inside, buried under layers of dust and scrap metal, was a box filled with old VHS tapes. One was labeled simply, July 97 Shop Cam. The footage, grainy and time-stamped, showed the usual routine of the garage's exterior: cars pulling in, employees smoking on break. But at 2:27 p.m. on July 12, something caught the investigators' attention. Across the street, near the edge of the canal, Marlene's white USPS truck was clearly visible. She was seen getting out and approaching a figure standing just outside the frame. Seconds later, the figure stepped into view. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark uniform with what appeared to be a reflective safety vest. The timestamp continued as Marlene appeared to hesitate, then suddenly flinch. The man lunged toward her, and in a blur of motion, she was forced toward the side of the building. The camera didn't capture the actual violence, but her body language was unmistakable: she was in danger. Moments later, the man reappeared alone, glancing around before walking calmly toward the canal. Zooming into a brief glimpse of his profile, investigators saw a face they had missed in 1997. Tom Rinsley, a city maintenance worker who lived just blocks from the canal and often performed in scheduled repairs in the area. His name had once appeared in a list of city employees who worked along the canal, but since there was no reason to suspect foul play at the time, he was never interviewed. Now, armed with the footage and his name, detectives dug deeper. Tom had left Indiana in 1999 and moved to Arizona. His work record was patchy, and neighbors from the 90s recalled his volatile temper and strange behavior. One former coworker mentioned that Tom had once argued with Marlene when she refused to deliver a package he hadn't signed for, an incident that was never formally reported. Police obtained a warrant and tracked Tom down in a small desert town outside Phoenix. The man who answered the door was older, heavier, and gray-haired, but unmistakably the same figure from the VHS tape. When shown the footage and told about the discovery of Marlene's body, he didn't speak. His hands trembled. It was the first crack in a carefully maintained silence that had lasted for 7 years. Behind his eyes, detectives saw something else: fear. Something Tom Rinsley had buried deep had just resurfaced, and they were about to dig it all the way out. Back in Indianapolis, detectives worked around the clock to assemble the evidence needed to ensure Tom Rinsley couldn't slip through the cracks of the justice system. The footage from the old garage camera had sparked the investigation back to life, but it was only the beginning. Over the course of 2 weeks, authorities quietly built a case, tracing Tom's movements, interviewing former colleagues, and pulling up his employment and travel records from the summer of 1997. Every thread they tugged on unraveled a little more of the lie he had been living for years. When officers finally arrived at Tom's modest Arizona home with a warrant, he didn't resist. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. Sitting at his kitchen table, hands resting on the chipped surface, he didn't ask what they were there for. It was as though he had been waiting for this knock on the door for a very long time. During the formal interrogation, Tom tried to maintain a casual air at first. He claimed he didn't even remember Marlene. But when detectives placed a printed still frame from the VHS tape on the table, his expression shifted. Then came the forensic report: tiny traces of DNA. Collected from under Marlene's fingernails, remarkably well preserved due to the cold silt at the bottom of the canal, had been matched to Tom through a national database after a misdemeanor arrest years earlier. That was the turning point. Faced with the irrefutable evidence, Tom's demeanor crumbled. He slouched forward, eyes hollow, and quietly said, "She wouldn't let it go." Over several hours, he confessed. On that July afternoon, Marlene had encountered him while he was loitering behind one of the old warehouses. She recognized him from previous run-ins. He'd made her uncomfortable before, often hovering too close when she delivered mail near city worksites. That day, she caught him in the act of breaking into one of the abandoned buildings, a crowbar in hand. She threatened to report him to the police and even tried to radio it in from her truck. In a fit of panic and rage, Tom struck her with the crowbar. When she collapsed, he panicked further, dragging her unconscious body down a maintenance path to the canal and forcing her under a submerged grate. He weighted her down with a toolbox and a section of broken piping, hoping the canal would hide her forever. The sheer brutality of it stunned investigators, not only for its violence, but for the cold calculation he showed afterward. Tom returned to the warehouse, cleaned himself off, and walked home as if nothing had happened. Over the years, he convinced himself that silence would protect him, that time would erase what he had done. And for a while, it did. Tom Rinsley was extradited to Indiana and formally charged with first-degree murder, unlawful concealment of a body, and obstruction of justice. His trial drew enormous public attention. In court, Marlene's husband Steve and their now grown children sat silently as the man responsible for their years of torment finally stood before a judge. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Tom was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, he gave no final statement, no apology, no glance at the family he had destroyed. But justice, long delayed, had finally been delivered. In the months following Tom Rinsley's conviction, the Whitaker family began the slow, aching process of healing. The trial had brought closure, but not peace. Justice had been served, yes, but it didn't bring Marlene back. Her absence lingered in every quiet morning, in every empty chair at family dinners, in the milestones she would never witness. But now they had something they hadn't had for 7 long years: truth. And truth, in its own way, allowed them to breathe again. The city of Indianapolis responded to the case with a rare outpouring of solidarity. Community members, many of whom had followed the story since the day Marlene disappeared, came together to honor her memory. At a public forum held in the city council chamber, several residents proposed dedicating a section of the restored canal in Marlene's name, not only as a tribute, but as a reminder of the importance of never forgetting the missing, the silenced, and the unheard. The council unanimously approved the motion. 3 months later, on a bright fall morning, the newly renovated walking path along the canal was officially unveiled as Whitaker Way. It ran directly through the area where Marlene had last been seen, and where, years later, her remains had finally been found. At the dedication ceremony, local officials, USPS representatives, and dozens of residents gathered to listen to Marlene's daughter, now 19, deliver a powerful and emotional speech. Holding her mother's mailbag, carefully restored and preserved by the family, she read a letter Marlene had written just days before her disappearance. It was a simple, heartfelt message meant for her children, written on a notepad she kept in her mail truck. Always do what's right, even when no one's watching. Be the voice for someone who's lost theirs. And if one day you feel afraid, remember, your heart is braver than you know. Those words, read aloud in the same area where her voice had been silenced, brought tears to the eyes of nearly everyone present. They were more than just words from a mother, they were a legacy. A call to action. A reminder that doing the right thing isn't always safe, or easy, or even acknowledged. But it's necessary. The USPS honored Marlene by placing a commemorative plaque inside the Indianapolis Central Post Office where she had started her route that fateful day. Her name was added to the National Postal Museum's Memorial Wall, where those lost in the line of duty are forever remembered. Steve, though still grieving, found purpose in advocacy, working with organizations that support families of missing persons and lobbying for better surveillance and response protocols for postal workers across the country. For the residents of Indianapolis, Whitaker Way became more than just a canal path. It became a place where people came to reflect, to walk in silence, to remember a woman whose dedication to her everyday duties had made her a quiet hero. Flowers and letters would sometimes appear on the trail, placed by strangers who had never known Marlene but had been touched by her story. Though the city would move on, as cities always do, it now carried her name, not just on a signpost but in its collective conscience. Marlene Whitaker, once vanished without a trace, would never be forgotten again.